Thank you very much. My name is David Sperling. I'm happy to be here with you today to discuss my professional career in Kenya. I spent most of my life here in Kenya. I arrived in Kenya on the 26th of July, 1960. I'd come here to teach. I had no authority to teach because as an American citizen, I was now entering a British colony, and in order to teach in a British colony, you needed to have a graduate degree from a British university. That's another full story that I can tell. There were other members of Opus Dei here who were practicing their profession. I want to make it clear that members of Opus Dei don't go someplace to begin an institution. They go there to practice their profession. If there are opportunities to do something in an area which is a public service to communities in that country, then they might be attracted to do that. And this is exactly what happened in Kenya. So we began, and there was a chance and opportunity to begin a sixth form educational institution. We'll go into that in a bit more detail in just a moment. I spent much of my life either beginning this institution named Strathmore College, or helping in the beginning of Strathmore School, and eventually the university, Strathmore University, which came out of these two earlier institutions. I used to think it was just a challenge, but I now realize that it was a privilege. This is an interesting concept. It took me a long time to realize this. I realized it was a privilege because if you look at what we could call the rudiments and what can we say, the workings of social life, we get into something what we put into it. This is also true of relationships. We get into a relationship what we actually contribute to it, whether it's a relationship of marriage or friendship. And so I say this is a privilege because I put many of my energies and talents into Strathmore and the different institutions of Strathmore. And by doing this, I received much. I received from what I put into the institution. That's why I say it's not just a challenge, it was a privilege. That I would be challenged, in a sense, to do something that required a lot of effort, a lot of energy, a lot of sleepless nights, you might even say, traveling, whatever it was. Let me not exaggerate too much that this was such a big challenge. Why? Because there are many people, and I want to name one in particular, who were helping and working in this endeavor. We're back to the year July 1960. A close friend, he became a close friend, Kevin O'Byrne, an extraordinary person, an engineer. He had done all of his studies in Ireland. He had done a master's in physics, physics, mathematics. He had done further studies in engineering. And he was here in Kenya already when I came. And he had set up he had immediately been employed by a British engineering firm. There was a shortage of professional people here in the 1960s. And he was working as an engineer in his profession. Another person I want to commend and mention, because we ended up working closely together, was another American, by them Edmund Hernandez. He had actually been born in Texas. The name you can see is that of someone who was a Spanish-speaking person, but he'd gone to Chicago to do his degree in architecture. He was a trained architect, he was a professional architect, and when he came here to Kenya, to work in Kenya, again, he immediately got a job in an architectural firm. Why? Because in 1960, there was a shortage of professionals here. I wanted to teach. I had a vocation for teaching. I had been teaching before and wanted to continue teaching. In order to teach, I was required to be interviewed. I was interviewed by the Director of Education because I did not have a degree from a British university. It was an amusing encounter, and eventually I made very close friends with the Director of Education in Kenya. We're back in 1960. It's a colony. All of the schools are controlled by the British government. There is no university in Kenya at this time. The British had favored Uganda, what was a protectorate. There were no settlers in Uganda, and it was also a protectorate of the British. Kenya was a colony of the British. There's a distinction here. Those of you who know history will know that distinction. They favored education in Uganda. In fact, Makerere College had been affiliated with the University of London. And Makerere College became an affiliated college of the University of London in 1948. Before in Kenya, we even have the advanced level secondary in the British system, which would qualify you to go to a university, a British university. Makerere College began a school of education. Interestingly enough, that school of education then, because it needs places for its pupils to teach, the Makerere College established, I think it was 1951-52, a school, Makerere College School. And that school was offering the British curricula. They were offering the Cambridge examinations, both at ordinary level and advanced level. Here in Kenya, we were offering, when I say we, I became a Kenya citizen. Here in Kenya, we were offering the Cambridge O-level certificate, but we were not offering advanced certificate here. There were no advanced secondary studies, those 2 years that are required in the British system before you go to university. I give this introduction because it's in some way relevant to what Kevin O'Byrne and Edmund Hernandez, the architect, Kevin, the engineer, and myself, you say, the educator, what we came together and eventually managed to do. And this was to begin an advanced level college, not having any low or secondary degrees. What are we doing? We're asking ourselves, what does Kenya need us to do? We are professionals practicing our profession. What can we actually do with that profession? And here we have a group of persons whose professions complemented each other perfectly. What can we do with our profession to help society? This is the motto, what you might say, the leitmotif, which is imbued into the spirit of Opus Dei, service to society. We're not just there practicing a profession and gaining from our profession whatever that gain might be. We're using that profession to make some contribution to society. And in July 1960, what Kenya needed was advanced level secondary studies, because no single institution existed offering those studies in the country. I grew up in the United States. I'm originally from the state of Connecticut. That's where I did my education. I've always been interested in, it's interesting that I'm being asked this question or to talk about this, because I've always been interested in foreign people. When I was at school, I was at quite a good public school in the city of New Haven. And in my class, there were children of immigrants. So in my class, there's Joseph Romano, he comes from Italy. There's Briley, she's from Ireland. There was an African-American girl there whose parents had come from the south of the state, Sheila Francis. I'm remembering these people. There was somebody from Poland, actually, in that class, whose parents were Polish, but of course they're immigrants in the United States. We're talking about the 1940s. We're going right back to the early United States, where many immigrants are still coming there, mainly from Europe, a few from the South American. Immigration into the States has not yet begun. That's another feature. So I grew up in an environment where almost unconsciously, I was exposed to foreign peoples, even to foreign languages. I began to take an extraordinary interest in foreign languages. When I went to secondary school, my father was an archaeologist, and he spoke Greek. He wanted me to study Greek and Latin. So in my secondary school, I was studying Greek and Latin. I was studying French. It's all part of the same attraction, which is foreigners, foreign peoples, non-Americans, and the very languages that they speak. I'm just remembering this now. And then when I went on to university at Yale, I actually studied Russian for a couple of years. I took French. And then this links with my interest in history, a deep interest in the history of other peoples. I'm understanding myself, actually, as I talk now, more than I did before, because that interest in peoples and non-American peoples led to me undertaking an academic career in history. And you might even say, well, let me go on, because after finishing my first degree at Yale, I was particularly attracted by studies at Harvard University, and these studies related to the history of the Middle East and the Arab and Turkish and Iranian peoples. So I enrolled at Harvard, began to do a PhD in history. I was required to take a foreign exam, written foreign exam at the end of my 2 years coursework in either Iranian, Turkish, Hebrew, or Arabic. And in fact, I chose Arabic. I just got interested in the Arabic language. It's a long story here, which may not be relevant, but because I was studying Arabic intensively, I started my study of Arabic with 14 hours a week. This is part of a Harvard curriculum of an intensive language, which you're doing together with the courses you may be doing in economic history or history of religion, whatever it is. That was my introduction also to the history of Islam. There's a long personal story here, and I'm not sure this is the place to tell it, but I enrolled in Harvard as a graduate student in September 1955. I was not baptized. I had been brought up by a very good family, but my father, for some reason, had no interest in baptizing me. And so his idea was, you decide what you want to be, so to speak, when you grow up. So here I enter Harvard, 1955, I'm 20 years old, and I have not been baptized. And the introduction, you might say, my first introduction to a universal religion in depth was an introduction to Islam. Because I literally began reading the Quran and read the Quran before I had read the Bible. I knew passages from the Bible. My mother's mother, my grandmother, used to come and visit us. I would see her reading the Bible. And occasionally, I'm a young boy, I would go over and see, she'd say this, and she'd give me some quotation from Psalm that she likes. I remember my grandmother liked particularly the Psalm, the Lord is my shepherd, and she told me that Psalm. So as a young boy, I learned that Psalm from my grandmother, but I wasn't baptized and I wasn't a Christian. I'd never gone to church with my family. Now we're in Kenya. I'm fascinated by the people here. I'm fascinated by the languages. I'm fascinated by the educational system. And that educational system in Kenya, as I briefly mentioned before, included lower secondary studies, but a Kenyan who wanted to do advanced secondary in order to go to university in Britain would have to go to Makerere College. There was no advanced secondary institution in Kenya. Another aspect of education in Kenya, which was very striking to me and in some way relevant, in 1912, the British had passed an educational ordinance, and that educational ordinance required that schools be racially segregated. Even missions here, Europeans, Asians, many of the European settlers were here in the country at that time, About 60,000 Europeans were in Kenya at 1960 when I arrived, even a larger number of Asians. The figure that comes to mind, about 125,000 Asians. You have a very large immigrant community here of Europeans and Asians. They had their own schools, but those schools were racially categorized. So this is a school only for Asians. These are schools only for Europeans. Many missionary schools and even the British government schools were only for Africans. You had a deeply racially divided educational system. And this was in law, the Educational Ordinance of 1912. This applied to many aspects of society as well. Well, now Kevin O'Byrne, an engineer, Ed Hernandez, an architect, and myself here, we might say language and history studies. We have an opportunity here because the county government has announced that in 1961 they are going to begin advanced level educational institutions. There's no thought of independence. They're doing this for their own people, and they're doing it for the people who are here. If you are a Kenyan who knows Nairobi, in 1961, there was not a single-day secondary school for Africans in Nairobi. This is a telling feature of the city. This was not an African city. This was a European city. The mayor of London had come to Kenya in 1950, and the British government had declared Nairobi to be a city according to the laws of England. But it wasn't an African city, it was a European city. You would go into the center of town. I'm talking now about July 1960, after I arrived here. You go into the center of Nairobi, you don't see any Africans there. They're not there. They're just not there. You're walking through the streets, and the only people in the streets are Europeans. It's a fascinating insight here, and very difficult for someone who did not live through this to imagine that you're walking around the city of Nairobi, and literally you see very few, if any, Africans or Asians. We were clearly not satisfied or going to accept the segregation, the racial segregation that the British had imposed. Kevin and I, together with two other people, put together a proposal to the Kenya Colonial government. This eventually became what is today the Strathmore Educational Register of Trustees. We wanted to begin a A-level school. And the need for A-level education, it didn't exist. It didn't make sense, really. There were many, many secondary schools in Kenya, the basic level of Form 4. It didn't make sense that we would use our energies to start a school at that level. But there was a need, and very much this was the thinking that we had. What does Kenya need us to do? And one of the needs was A-level. So we applied, we got permission to begin an A-level. That would have been, for those of you who know the British system, only Form 5 and 6. This meant we would be accepting men, who was only for boys at that point, we'd be accepting boys from Form 4 schools. We didn't have a Form 4. This was a challenge. We've got nothing to build on. We're actually building an institution, you might say, in isolation from any kind of a foundation before it. But that also meant, what can I say, it gave us the freedom to plan and construct an educational institution at a much higher level than the ordinary secondary school in Kenya. Not because we're better, but because we're only focusing on advanced secondary, that is Form 5 and 6. There's a long story here. We're looking for funds. We needed land. We're very lucky because, as it turned out, the British had given a grant, a very large grant of 200 acres of land to the Catholic missions in Nairobi. It's an area where the very earliest Catholic missionary church St. Austin's was built in 1913. In other words, this is now part of the city of Nairobi. It's in the bush, so to speak. Nairobi, there are no buildings outside this central core in 1913 that the British settlers set up. So the British have a settler colony here. They create the settlement in Nairobi. It's surrounded by forests. It's surrounded by what Kenya Africans like to call bush. It's not really bush. It's just land which has not been ever settled or used. There could be trees, there could be bushes or forests. And that's all in the term which Kenyans call bush, in the sense that nobody's living there. So there were hundreds of dozens of acres, even in 1960, surrounding the British colonial European city of Nairobi. Those of you who are familiar with Nairobi will know of the settlement of Riruta. Riruta today, in 2025, is a housing settlement. And you have a new Riruta with some very good houses. In 1960, Riruta was an African village with people living in customary houses on farms and cultivating their crops. I know this because one of our very first students who was accepted into Strathmore College in Form 5 was a young boy called John Muigai. John Muigai lived in Riruta. When I went to visit his family, I was visiting an African family who had their farm and they were growing maize and they were surrounded by farms in Riruta. So those of us who maybe were born 10 years ago, you have to try to imagine what Nairobi was like 65 years ago. It was a very small town surrounded by African settlement on the one hand, moving to the north and the west, and surrounded by Maasai herders and pastoralists as you move to the east and to the south. All of the guards, the security guards, when I say all, maybe 90% of the security guards of the Europeans who were living in Nairobi and the European town of Nairobi in 1960, 95% of those guards were Maasai. And they were Maasai because the other people around Nairobi feared the Maasai. The Maasai are the guards with their spears. So you're not going to go to a house where you see there's wealth there because you know that there's a Maasai guarding that house and he's got a spear. And you'll have a difficult time with him if you try to get into that house. Well, it's interesting because here I am now, I'm a graduate student at Harvard. I'm being introduced to a famous world religion, Islam. I'm actually reading the Quran. One of my close friends who was also studying Arabic with me was from Persia. He didn't know Arabic. We were in the same class. And we became close friends. He's a Muslim from Iran. And we were going to have lunch together. So we're reading the Quran, we're studying Arabic. We go out of class, hey, let's go have lunch together. I remember him very well. His name was Hussein. We would have our copies of the Quran with us in Arabic. It would be interesting because I might ask him a question about Islam, and he would pick up his Quran, he would kiss the book, and then he would open it. Wow, he said, hey, this is a really powerful religion. It was my first exposure deeply to one of the main universal religions of the world. Interestingly, as a graduate student at Harvard, you're allowed to audit any course you want to audit. So I started saying, well, let me do some history course in addition to the courses I'm required to do for my degree. So literally walking around the campus, I was checking outside each classroom. You have a notice of this particular class. I came to a classroom and I read the notice, History of Medieval Thought. Professor, I forget the professor's name. Hey, this looks interesting. I'm interested in ideas. History of medieval thought. So all I had to do as a graduate student was to wait there. The class begins at say 9:15, I waited for the professor to come. I forget his name. I said, Professor, I'm a student here doing history. I'd like to audit your course. You're a graduate student. He said, yeah, you're welcome. You're welcome to audit my course. So I actually went in and started sitting in his course. History of medieval thought. Well, who were the great medieval theologians and thinkers? I'm introduced to Thomas Aquinas. I'm introduced to other, you just have one church at that time in medieval Europe. It's the Catholic Church. And I'm introduced intellectually to a fascinating world of ideas that I had never known before. Carrying on here, because I'm being asked to explain how did I happen to become a Catholic. I go to Harvard, I'm not baptized. Well, I'm now being introduced to the medieval thought of Europe. It's powerful, it's intellectually attractive to me. There's a church near the Harvard campus, St. Paul's. It's the Catholic Church. There are many churches around it. There's a Methodist church, this is what can we say, a multi-religious community in Cambridge, Massachusetts. But the Catholic Church is very, very close to the Harvard campus. And if I wanted to go down to the river to go rowing, which is my favorite sport, I would walk by that church. So one day, I went to the door of the church, just out of curiosity. The front door, it was locked. Hey, what's this? What kind of a church is this? It's locked. And somebody else was there. I said, no, there's a side entrance. You have to go down. There's a chapel in the basement. So I opened that door to go down to the basement. Went into the basement. I remember this, I'm getting a bit emotional now. I remember this very well because in the basement there's nothing. But there's a statue of the Blessed Virgin Mary. I looked at the statue. I knew the Blessed Virgin Mary was the mother of Jesus Christ. I left, and then I don't know how it began to happen, but it did happen. If you want to talk in theological terms, this was a special grace I was being given. I would stop by and go down into the basement of that church, and I began praying to the Blessed Virgin Mary. I didn't even know what the Eucharist was. But there was something told me, and I'm going to these classes on the history of medieval thought, this woman is something special. She's got some. I was not a praying person, and I never sat down. My mother never sat down with me, and I never learned prayers as a young boy, which would happen in a Catholic family. I never saw my father pray, much less. My father was an intellectual who was not in favor of organized religion at all. As I grew older, I realized this. My grandmother, was reading the Bible, and she was the one who told me this psalm. She was reading it, she taught me this psalm, the shepherd. The Lord is my shepherd. Okay, the Lord is my shepherd. It didn't mean too much to me, but my grandmother was there. I was actually the favorite grandson and spent a lot of time with her. She had 6 grandsons from 3 different daughters, and I was the youngest. So whenever she would come to visit, I was like her favorite grandson. Anyway, let's get back to St. Paul's Church. And so I am, maybe once a week, I walk by the church. Hey, let me just go downstairs. And the statue is there. I start praying. I hadn't prayed much in my life at all. I'd never gone to Mass. There's something happening here which goes beyond the realm, you might say, of human understanding. Because eventually, out of this came, in March 19, let's get the date, you're right here. You're looking at March 1956. In March 1956, I went to the door of the priest's house next to St. Paul's, and the priest came and answered the doorbell, and I said, Father, I think I want to become a Catholic. I'm not sure. And the priest very warmly welcomed me and said, well, fine, let's just meet. And we arranged a time to meet, and we'll have a chat and a talk. So this was Father Collins. He was the priest. He wasn't the Monsignor. He was actually the priest of the St. Paul's Parish. I don't think this is a recording about my religious life, but eventually I ended up getting instruction. I ended up being baptized in that very church in the Easter Vigil of March 31st, 1956. So here I am, just finishing my first year of a 2-year course at Harvard, and there was a dramatic change, you might say, in my own personal life. Why? Because I was introduced to Islam, I was introduced to the whole concept of a universal religion, and then I had the privilege of being able to audit a course on the medieval thought of Europe. June 1956, I was about to go to Saudi Arabia because I had employed by the Arabian American, nobody knows Arabic, and I was employed by the Arabian American Oil Company for a management traineeship. And they were going to fly me to Arabia. I was about to go down to New York, which I would get the plane, which took me eventually to Saudi Arabia. But this is early June 1956. I'm finishing my very first year at Harvard. I have a second year to go. And I know on a notice board, the Harvard Catholic Club is holding a social whatever on this day. Come and join the other members of the Harvard Catholic Club. I knew no Catholics at Harvard. I said, yes, socially, let me go find some friends there. So let me go to this club. I'm about to travel overseas, but it's a chance to make friends with other Catholics on the campus. I know nobody there. So I went to that social reunion of the Kenya Catholic Club. At the social reunion of the Catholic Club was the director of Trymount House, which was the residence of Opus Dei. He had been at the Easter Vigil ceremony where I was baptized. So Carl Schmidt, my head was above the crowd, you might say. He came up to me. Hey, I'm Carl Schmidt. Are you the person I saw being baptized in the vigil service at St. Paul's? Yeah, I was. Hey, well, happy to meet you. Now, Carl Schmidt was assistant professor of history at Harvard. He was doing his PhD, but I never met him. So the girls were thinking, yeah, hey, let's meet for lunch someday. So I said, well, actually, I'm traveling overseas next week, so I'm sorry I can't have lunch with you. Yeah, okay, when you're back on campus, yeah, I'll get in touch. That's how I got in touch with Opus Dei. I mean, you look at Providence at work here. I had no intention, much less desire